Hello. This is Tamika Peters, President and CEO of Grow Your Nonprofit, where we help startups, small and stagnant nonprofits grow through fundraising strategy, strategic planning, and so much more. Guys, today you're in for a treat. I have my special guest, Elbert Maxwell. He is a DEI expert. He will share with you DEI in tech and the rise and fall in DEI. But before we get started, I'd like to thank the sponsors of my podcast. Trinity Life Foundation enables help and at-risk youth through their enrichment programs. AVID, that stands for the Association of Haitians Living Abroad. They just opened an amazing support center right here in the beautiful Fort Myers, where they will help you with immigration support, utility billing, and English as a second language. Best Insurance USA, a Florida Blue provider. Last but not least, Vaxtruth. They just received a grant from the CDC to raise awareness of COVID-19 and vaccine resources in the Black and Brown communities. So, guys, like I said, my special guest here, Elle. How are you doing, Elle?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Grow Your Nonprofit podcast. We're doing something a little bit different. Earlier this year, I came out with a diversity, equity, inclusion passport workbook. I felt that workbook was very important because as companies implement DEI, there needs to be an ongoing follow-up, an ongoing initiative and intention about learning more about yourself as well as other cultures and just making yourself just a better person. So with that said, I've known Elbert for a few years. He's a little disclaimer. He is my husband's godson, and we recently connected last year. So we got to talking about DEI, and he has a wealth of knowledge in DEI. So I wanted to further explore this interview with a podcast. So, Elbert, why don't you share with our audience a little bit about yourself, your background, education, and how you got into this field?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tamika, again for having me. Hello, everyone. My name's Elbert Maxwell. Originally from the East Coast, and after doing undergrad, I moved out west with the intent on sort of eventually working in technology. Initially, I had a stint sort of training briefly for the USA Olympic team. And so there I got to meet folks of many different countries, different cultures, traveled the world competing. And after that chapter in my life, I ended up working in technology. Also went back to school, so I did my master's degree in emerging science and technology policy, where I learned a lot about how folks are able to do what they do in that space out in Silicon Valley and places like that. And began my career working with autonomous vehicles. So I started with Waymo. I then moved over to Silicon Valley, where I joined Toyota Research Institute, and since then have been with about 3 or 4 other companies, all working in the same space. And so I've always sort of been involved with DEI, interested in DEI, all the way from my sort of beginnings with working in tech and sort of carrying over that sort of multicultural experience that I had training and being an athlete, and sort of integrating that into the tech space within my teams, within leadership and other folks and other measures. And then eventually, I should say, as I moved over to Toyota Research Institute, I eventually had the opportunity to step in and lead our new division, which was our diversity, equity, and inclusion division. And there I got to do lots of cool and fun and amazing things, and learned a lot about some really important work that I learned that a lot of other folks had been doing, were doing, and are going to continue to do. And I hope to continue to support that.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. So what is DEI anyway? When we say DEI is diversity, equity, inclusion, I know, especially living here in the state of Florida, is looked upon very negatively. Like DEI is the new affirmative action, but DEI is much more than that. Can you elaborate on what really is DEI?
Absolutely, yeah. So, just to break it down, right, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Each of those 3 are sort of codependent on one another, but also, exist on their own, right? Mutually exclusive. And so when we talk about diversity, it's not just skin color or which country you come from, right? It's diversity in all aspects. So we're looking for, diversity in what kinds of schools people went to, or what, generally speaking, what their educational background is, what part of the country they come from, or what part of the world they come from, what their family circumstances are, what their financial circumstances are. what their previous kind of history is. Did they have military experience? Have they traveled a lot, right? Have they led in other aspects? Are they parents? Are they not parents? These are all sorts of things, right, that kind of go into what it means to sort of create a diverse workplace and continue to do so. And then when we talk about equity, right? Equity is a very important part of that conversation, because equity and equality do not mean the same thing, right? As many folks know. And so equality means giving everyone, right, the exact same thing, right? If I'm giving everyone a ladder with 3 steps on it, then that's great. But what we fail to acknowledge a lot of the times is that not everyone is coming from the same starting point. And many folks, particularly people of color, and many people within this country, and especially people that come from outside of this country, right, are all dealing with different circumstances that don't really necessarily start them off in the same starting block, I shall say, as other folks. And so when we talk about equity, really what we're talking about is, are we looking at everyone's circumstances individually and giving them the necessary step up, the necessary help, assistance, necessary opportunities, so that they too can be successful, and their families, right? And then lastly, when we talk about inclusion in an inclusive environment, that one a lot of times tends to go over people's head, because people will say, well, we have folks, of all different, cultures and colors that work here, people under all sorts of different flags. And so I don't understand how anyone could say that it's not an inclusive environment. But when you talk about sort of the things that we do at work, and sort of the intangibles, right, they're usually catered toward, a particular group. For example, right, a lot of my companies, all hands meetings are one of these things that we've had, right? Particularly, during the beginning and end of the all hands meeting, they're always playing, music, right? There's always, different time period of some sort of music, but it's usually music by a Caucasian artist, right? It's usually something that's very, mainstream, Billboard Top 100 kind of thing. But it's never music that's in a different language. For example, it's never, something maybe a little bit more upbeat that everyone knows. It's never, R&B or hip hop or something of that nature, which can be done in a clean and inclusive manner, right? It's usually never those things, right? So, for example, those are the kinds of things we talk about when we talk about creating an inclusive environment. The kinds of language we use when we're, disclosing and communicating emails and things of that nature. Do they not just pertain to a certain group that we're all sort of trying to fit into, but is it inclusive of everyone? How we all speak, how we all interact with each other, what are all of our, our normal cultural norms are, those kinds of things.
What's interesting about that is that I think we all have biases, whether we realize it or not, but being intentional and being educated about it, it's a different thing. But it's like you really don't really think about that, because I host a quarterly training for one of my clients, and it's a medical clinic, and the staff is predominantly Haitian Creole, and then there's Spanish, and then there's some white. And I've never even thought about, because I was talking about the types of music I like, and one of the employees from the audience said, well, what about compa? That's Haitian Creole music. And he was like, do you like compa? I like compa, but I didn't mention it. I was just throwing some things off the top of my head. I love Afro beats. I love R&B. I love this and that. And he was like, what about compa? I was like, wow. So you're it's like, even though you're intentional, sometimes you don't think about that. And then you mentioned like in another language. Now I haven't even thought about that, and I think that I'm inclusive. But the more and more I talk to you, I know that I have like so much further to go. So how do you I guess the question is, how do you get out of your own way and be more intentional with DEI, especially when you're working with a group of people from all those different backgrounds and experiences, to sort of come together and work for the greater good, is really to fulfill the mission of the company?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And largely, I think for me, what that has meant and what it continues to mean is continuing to be a student of DEI and not assuming that you know everything. And I think a lot of times folks can sort of attach that to someone especially when they step into a DEI role, right? that automatically means because this person's in, this position that they know everything about all cultures and societies and all languages and yada, yada. And that's largely not the case, right? And so really what it means is continuing to be a student. For myself, right, working in a space where, I'm usually one of, if not the only Black person in that space. I had to kind of take that with a grain of salt, but still have an understanding of what my role is, because it is to serve all people, right? And so a lot of times you do have to educate yourself, because as you mentioned, right, you realize when you get to certain things and certain topics that you're like, I guess I don't have, a diverse mindset or an inclusive mindset about this. And that means I need to kind of dive deeper, right? Have more conversations, read more, listen to more podcasts and interviews. And then take sort of under my wing the folks around me, and really kind of explain to them what my lack of understanding is, where I'm coming from, and explaining how they can help me, and bridging that gap.
Something else, now that I'm having this conversation with you, I had a big missed opportunity today. So today I went to go check out a location for our training in the fall. So I stopped by this restaurant that sells lobster rolls. So I went in and I noticed there was a gentleman. There was no one in the restaurant. There was a gentleman sitting on the left, and he obviously worked there, but he didn't say anything to me. But I didn't. Okay, I'm like, okay, I want a lobster roll. So what if the customer service sucks? So I proceed to the cash register, and here's this note. The note says, Our staff member can help you, however, he is deaf. Use the kiosk to place your order, and then he will get the order. I guess it will print out in the back, and he will fulfill your order. And I thought about it. I said, I said, I'm going to do this, but will I be back? Is that really good customer service? And it also had the telephone number if you had any questions to call. I said, I said, let me just go ahead and do it anyway. So I did it. And sure enough, he made my lobster roll. It was absolutely delicious. He brought it to my table. And then another lady came in. She was an older lady, so she didn't read the sign. And she tried to talk to him. And he tried his best to talk to her. But it was clear that he was deaf, because, the way, how he was trying to talk. And then he was instructing her to press the kiosk. But I thought about it. I said, this is great. But it's very interesting how, I don't know if this young man is maybe a relative of the owner, or they just hired him. But I thought that was a pretty big risk to take. I know this is slow season in Florida, but I thought that was a pretty big risk to take for that. So I don't know how I feel about that. What do you have to say about it? I don't know how I feel about that. I thought that was great for giving him an opportunity, but I don't know how to feel about that. I mean, I proceeded with my lobster roll. It didn't affect the quality of the food. So I don't know.
I think it's an interesting concept, because I think, at face value, right, there is some sort of enterprise risk, or perhaps a risk to your bottom line, right, as a company or service, right, if you are employing someone with some sort of disability, especially something that may hinder the way folks are used to communicating, right, with one. I think on the other hand, though, it's kind of, I like to compare this to bike lanes, right? If you're somebody who doesn't ride a bike at all, and let's say they just put new bike lanes in your neighborhood, or right in your normal commute to work, and now you're noticing there's pillars up, and you have to drive up further to make turns, and there's an extra light now for the cyclist before you get to go. It's probably really irritating for you, right?
Right.
And understandably so, because it's taking you out of your normal routine, and it's kind of frustrating. In that regard, though, right, we all agree that if you're on a bike, you should have a safe, dedicated lane to ride. Yeah. And I look at that question very similarly, right? We need to normalize what it means to be an employee, what it means to be a customer, what it means to be serving our customers, blah, blah, blah. When you come in somewhere, it's just because we've created a cultural norm of it does not mean that it should always be expected, right? Or that that business is doing something wrong because you have to do something out of the norm, right? That you're not used to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we have to normalize that. I realize now, like when I'm a cyclist, right? I like to hop on my bike and get some miles in. When I am places, I gotta take my bike with me places too. When I am places, for example, maybe outside of San Francisco or in a different city, where they don't have bike lanes. Like when I'm back here in Arizona and I'm cycling, and normally a lot of streets they don't have bike lanes because they're just not used to it out here. People aren't looking for cyclists, and therefore they're just swinging the right on red, and they're doing different things. And I have to be a lot more conscious. And so I think it's important to normalize those things so that people are more conscious of how they communicate. Because how many other times do we come across someone who may be deaf, and then we just start yelling stuff at them, right?
Right.
I think they don't hear us or whatever. But how many of us know somebody who's like, hey, so-and-so's hard of hearing, so you're gonna have to speak up a little bit or talk in their other ear, that kind of thing. So we all know how to do it, but we need to be more conscious of it in a day-to-day society.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And then when you look back at it and you I express how I felt about that, it almost makes me feel a little embarrassed. But I guess what I felt was normal too. So because I had mixed emotions about it. I thought it was great on one hand, but on the other hand, I was like, But I went ahead and I did purchase the lobster rolls. So I thought that was interesting. So before we recorded this podcast, we talked last week, and specifically DEI and technology, and then we'll move on to the rise and fall of DEI. So is it, right? DEI and technology. So you're working in Silicon Valley, right? Dream job. Everyone thinks about that. That's where the place you go to get rich, right? So what was that experience like? Because we also talked about some technology, something as simple as going to the restroom and washing your hands. And if you maybe have a darker complexion and maybe the water's not coming on. And I said, hey, that's actually happened to me a few times, but I just figured maybe my hand wasn't in the right position. And now when I thought about it, I said, well, if I went like this, my hands are white, but I think probably most people would go like this. But let's touch on that technology where maybe you kind of touched on maybe perhaps a group of people were not maybe tested when this technology was out, and how could they remedy that?
Absolutely, yeah. So when I first started working at Toyota Research Institute, that was one of the first things that I had a conversation with our CEO at the time, Gil Pratt, and we were talking about how potentially DEI and having a vast data repository, right, to choose from. Or to train your sort of machine learning algorithms on, whatever it may be, is extremely important. And so he tasked us with coming back to one of our, at the time we had a sort of a diversity board, right? So he tasked us with sort of coming back here with a personal story about how you have been affected, if you had one, right? How you have been affected by DEI and technology, so to speak. I at the time was not thinking about it, but was thinking about how we were doing testing, and some of the sensors that we were using sometimes had difficulty picking up on darker colored objects or black vehicles or large vehicles, things like that. And I thought about it, and I kind of raised my hand, and I was like, I'm not sure if this has anything to do with it. And mind you, we're sitting in the room with PhDs and all sorts of other folks, people who've been working in the industry for years and years, folks who are a lot more technical even than I. And so I was explaining to them about this, and I was explaining the story about how when I go into the restroom, right, and I go to wash my hands, particularly when it's sort of in a low lit area, a lot of the times the water just won't come out. And the same issue when you go to dry your hands, right, the dryer just won't come on. And how that happens to me so often. And I was simply just telling the story to explain to other folks, right? There are little things that happen to people of color on a daily basis that most people can't even imagine or wouldn't even think of, because it's a normal thing for you for the water to come on. I was simply telling that story. And then one of the other hardware engineers who works with the sensors, right, then raised their hand And this was a white gentleman, right? And then explained to me sort of that sensor, which is an infrared sensor, basically works with light, right? So it bounces light off the object, and it basically works like a radar, right? Like a motion detector. As soon as it detects that something's underneath it, it bounces the light off, the water comes on. When you move your hands out, the water comes off. If you have, darker pigmented skin, if you're highly melanated, as we like to say, when you put your hand under there, a lot of the times that infrared sensor doesn't pick up because it's not producing enough light. Your hand's not bouncing enough light back off, and therefore the water won't come out. If you ever experience that, that is why. It's because that technology, once it was tested and people realized it worked right, was deployed all over the world, right? Restrooms all over the world, these exact same sensors that work. But it wasn't tested on people of color. It wasn't tested on, for example, let's say other folks. So they have like things that work on a sort of a little more of a technical basis, right? Like reading where your hand is and the shape of it and yada yada. But if you have maybe an abnormal hand, if you're missing a finger or two, if you're missing a hand, right, and want to go in to wash, right, a lot of the times it still doesn't work because those folks weren't tested. They weren't included in the testing data, and that's why. It's another really good example of why DEI and technology is so important, because when these types of things are tested and they work and then they're deployed across the world, right, there is inherently a certain percentage of the population that is affected negatively by the fact that they were not included in the beginning of the process.
Mm-hmm. So how do we have those conversations when we're in the midst of developing technology to think outside the box with being inclusive?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, you have to begin that conversation, I think, very blunt, but also forward thinking, right? We want to develop the best product possible, right? Or the best whatever it may be. How do we do that, right? And it starts with the folks that are in the room, right? And the people who have the decision-making power, exposing them to their own biases, right? Exposing them to things that they also may not realize. Things like that story that I just told, right? They're not going to think of that, right? And therefore sort of hand down the directive that we need to be a little bit more inclusive, right? And diverse in our hiring practices and how we hire and how we retain employees and all these things. And we need to actively seek out diverse ways to collect data, right? And so once they sort of understand that, and really that kind of means speaking with data, right? Use data-driven results, right? Data-driven decision-making, and presenting that data to them and saying, this can be so much better if we take a little bit more time, right? And really diversify the data. It can be a much better product because maybe you're not experiencing this, but see how many of these other folks are experiencing this who then may not want to use your product. You're missing out, right? On a certain subset of what could be additional bottom line. So yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when I think about DEI, I think somehow it became this dirty word or dirty words or dirty connotation. But when I think about it, the more and more we have a conversation, it's more than something that comes out of the human resource department that is one person that does the training on a monthly or quarterly basis about this. But we just talked about DEI technology, but it starts from the top. So if the CEO believes in it and it's spread throughout more than the DEI officer per se, but throughout the company with our thinking, it really affects like everything. Because I think about probably about 3 years ago, I went to a women's health conference. And so it was for a local hospital, and it was supposed to be for the community, but during the Q&A, they had like a panel discussion, and they talked about all these issues with minorities and high blood pressure and hypertension, cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer. But I kind of felt like at the end, they got a grant and they checked the box, because when I thought about the location it was really hard to find. The time of day they had it, it was like say it was like a Wednesday from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Your target audience is at work. You need to have that probably on a Saturday. You probably should even have it at a church or a community center. And then to take it a step further, the food they had, it was like sushi. So, I mean, at this point in my life, I can pretty much afford anything I want to eat. If I want sushi, I can have sushi. If I want whatever. But when I think about their target audience, do they even like sushi? Do they even know what sushi is? I'm like, sushi? And I understand it was like a health fair, but sushi? So, and I asked the question, and the room was silent. No one said anything. The air got thick, the energy changed, but I had, that's the question I had. I said, well, I said, who is the target audience? And sure enough, I was spot on with the target audience. And I mentioned that the location, the time of day, the day of the week, and then the food. And then after the event was over, a staff member who was Hispanic came up to me and she said, I'm so happy you asked that question because I brought that up during the meeting. I brought up all of these points that you talked about and they ignored me. And I was like, interesting. It was a grant and they probably just checked the box that they did it. And I was like, I got it. I know what that was all about. But I think that's interesting. I just mentioned that to say that if it comes from the top and is spread throughout the company, because I just think about like everything we do, like I was in transportation planning and we would plan projects out to the 20-year horizon. And we would have to have public information meetings to gather like public input about a road expansion of the highway and all that. And I would notate like, sometimes they would do a really good job as to what time they had the meetings because people would be at work. The working class people who mattered that affected their neighborhood, they usually didn't get involved. But I just think about like my career and the different things that I've done. DEI is beneficial in all aspects, but I think it has the wrong negative message that is only about, race. But it's so much more than like when you mentioned just developing the product or the music you play or maybe the food you serve or whatever, just being intentional. But what's the saying? If you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. So right. We could get more involved but it starts with education to have that seat at the table, because like you, in my career, I've always been the only one and the last one. But so that needs to change. So let's shift gears before we wrap up. We have about 10 minutes left. The rise and fall of DEI. Is that right? Because I know we mentioned in our last conversation about it was like a hot thing after George Floyd's death, and it's kind of dwindling down. Can you elaborate more on that?
Absolutely. So, I think right around the time of George Floyd's death, and then I'm blanking, right, 2020, like right around this time, we're also dealing with COVID and other sorts of things. Mm-hmm. DEI and sort of, I think the lack of diverse and inclusive spaces really became the forefront of a lot of the, topics of conversation. And the same was true, I think, in the tech space. It was really one of those moments where I think everyone was forced to confront what it was that we were seeing, what it was that our nation was dealing with, and what it was that a lot of folks were and had been dealing with for a very long time on a daily basis, for the most part. At that time, I think it was very difficult to ignore. And then I think there was also a lot of political pressure, right? I think a lot of sort of competitive pressure to be on the right side of history here. And so a lot of companies kind of, took up in arms and said, we're going to now be, the face of diversity, equity, and inclusion in this space, wherever it is that we operate. You saw companies like Toyota, for example, during Pride Month, posting, pictures of vehicles and all the different colors, right, creating the rainbow. Lots of really beautiful imagery, right, that the power and money that these companies have can use to really send a message. You saw other companies, like Nike, for example, posting that that they stand on behalf of the folks that are being oppressed, right, in this country, for example. You had other companies come out with statements, right. Walmart, Target, all these other people. Some on the positive side, right? Some on the negative side, but you either had someone speaking up for what was right, or you had silence, right? For the most part. And I think those folks who remained silent, there were a lot of fingers pointed at them. And I think they did start to see that affect their bottom line. Mm-hmm. Stores that weren't celebrating Black History Month in a positive manner, for example, right? people start posting online, people stop shopping there, all sorts of things happen, right? So I think even in the tech space, right, we saw this huge rise of DEI. You saw all these positions being posted for, diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator, manager, program manager, head of DEI, right? Chief diversity officer, right? CDO was a new thing that kind of came on board. And people were really taking this seriously. And I think, unfortunately, what happened was two things. I think one, what we all thought would happen, unfortunately happened, which was that this, like most things, right, and especially in this country, right, become a fad simply because we're all just taking in so much information on a daily basis that there's a rise of topics, then there's the fall of topics. And that was one thing that we really should have stood with and continued to take. Another thing is, I think I'm both fortunately and unfortunately, because I think it largely depends on how you look at it, but I think for the more important conversations, I will say, or the more hard-hitting conversations for people of this country and what we have historically dealt with, what lots of different groups have historically dealt with in this country, lots of those conversations were, I think, overshadowed by people sort of grabbing hold of DEI because it is, right, inclusive of everyone, and it does mean diverse in all aspects, which is very much true. But, maybe we don't get to have the conversations about racism and race in America. We don't get to have the conversations about sexism and, equal and equal opportunities, right, for everyone, and equal pay, right, for men versus women. We don't get to have these conversations about, how many people of color and or women do we actually have on the executive board? Have we ever had a female, CEO or chief anything? Lots of those conversations, right? Like, or, have we ever had anyone in the office who identifies as transgender, or, who dresses differently than they identify, right? Something of that nature. We've never get to have those conversations because I think so many other groups, right, tend to attach on to say, well, I would like to be included more. And again, none of these are wrong, right? But it's like, I would like to be included more because I'm a parent, right? So I would like to have conversations about potentially being able to split my workday between in office and at home so I can leave early to pick my kid up. I have someone that I'm caretaking for who's disabled, these kinds of things, right? Again, all of which are completely warranted. But unfortunately, I think when we talk about diversity, when we talk about equity, when we talk about inclusion, the part of the conversation that was largely left out, and this is an educational piece for the most part, which is that there have been forces within this country, forces within corporations, just general structure that we have in this country has actively worked against the progress of certain people. And when we can acknowledge that, then we know what to attack first, right? We have policies in place. We have, especially when you talk about voting season is coming around, right? Yeah. Folks are going to start showing up at the polls. Like, if you really read into the history of that, which we don't have to get into now, right? But you will know and understand that there are people who actively tried to prevent people like me and you from getting to the polls to vote. And not just that there's less people, that are Black and brown that are voting. It's not always the case, right? So once people can understand that, I think we probably could have gotten to a point, I think, where we can continue to build and build and build on that. And I think we largely have, but I think what happened too was it became a wave, right? And then, folks started to attach onto that. And I think we saw, last point I'll make, but during the protest, right, we saw that happen all over the country and all over the world. We saw certain folks who were there not for the reason that they should have been there. And I think, unfortunately, we had a lot of that. We had actors and different agents in all sorts of different schemes and situations where they used that position or they used what was happening to create ways to work against the progress that a lot of the folks were trying to make. And that even happened within technology, within these different corporations as well. And then that's when you started to see the fall of it, right? Like the term woke went from a positive thing to a very negative thing. And then companies wanted, they wanted more hands off. They didn't want to deal with this because some of the asks and requests and some of the things that were happening, if you ask most people, right, are kind of ridiculous in comparison to what was expected to happen. Some of those things were kind of ridiculous. And so that's when you started to see the fall, because I think with that sort of negative connotation attached to it, a lot of these companies wanted, hands off.
So in your opinion, what's the future of DEI?
The future of DEI, and I've always said this, even when was establishing ERGs and took my first position as a DEI program manager. The goal was always for me to not have a job anymore, right? The goal was always for this organization, this department, this wing of the company to not have to exist anymore. Because if we're truly being diverse, equitable, and inclusive, as just a part of our general, and this goes for every company and every workplace, right? If you're doing it as just a general part of your DNA, as just a general best practice in every and all cases, then it's never a question, right? Then naturally you should have a diverse workforce. Naturally, you will be inclusive of everyone because you'll be listening to everyone, and everyone will have a seat at the table and a voice in the conversation. Naturally, you'll be building more equitable practices. You'll be paying everyone the same as what they should be paid for a particular role. You'll have all these things. The fact that we have even people like myself who have stepped into these kinds of roles and doing this kind of work, right? Yourself as well, are because we recognize that there is a need and a gap to be filled. And the fact that a lot of places are no longer doing that. Some places, that's a good thing because they are just incorporating it as part of their DNA. But some places, right, it's like, as you mentioned before in the beginning of this conversation, right, you're checking the box and we put up the Instagram post of Pride Month and all the cars in different colors, or we put Black people in our commercial this month for the Lexus thing, and we leave it alone. If we're truly really doing that, then we'll just start to see all these changes happen naturally and continue to be a part of what we see on a day-to-day basis.
I like what you said, where we're incorporating it into our DNA. That's huge. That's huge. That's huge. That's really huge. So, any last words before we wrap up?
I think that finally I want to say, again, Tamika, thank you for having me. These conversations that we've been able to have been extremely fruitful. I hope that the folks listening have taken away at least a little bit of importance of what I've been saying. But largely, the last thing I do want to say is, we all as a society and our kids, the generations that are going to come after us are going to be much, much more connected through technology, right? And that means that things like fingerprint identification, facial recognition, AI, right? Like all these things really need to be looked into. Autonomous vehicles as well, right? Really need to be looked into from a DEI perspective to ensure that they are working positively and at the same rate for everyone. Because we're going to have a much, much bigger problem if we start to, again, right? At first we had institutions that were in place to prevent certain people from moving forward. If we willingly, though, without asking questions, put these institutions in place, again, as a society, willingly, without asking the questions of whether or not it works for me or other folks that are not experiencing life the same way I am, then we're going to have a much bigger problem. Because again, everyone is going to be reliant. You're going to have people using apps like Instagram, X, Facebook, Google Chrome, right? Blah, blah, blah. Everyone's using iPhones now, right? If I can't unlock my phone at night with the light on because of the color of my skin, but the next person can, right? That's an issue, for example, for safety. Like, let's say I need to call somebody and I need to be discreet. I can't do it because I can't get my phone unlocked, right? These are things we need to think about so that everybody can be safe and not just certain people. So I will leave you with that. I'm going to disclose this, and I probably shouldn't. I know this. So obviously, when I set up my phone, for face recognition, I had on makeup. So the phone want to open when I don't have makeup on it because it doesn't recognize me. I was like, oh my God, do I look that bad? See, don't let it make you feel bad.
No, that's not you. But anyway, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. We'll have to continue this conversation. So guys, I hope that you learned something here from this conversation with our special guest here, Elbert, DEI. I love what he said about incorporating it into your company's DNA. Not only your company's DNA, society DNA. It would just make our world a better place to live, work, and play. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And as I mentioned earlier, I have my DEI Passport workbook out there on Amazon. Go get your copy today. It'll take you on a journey of self-discovery where you will journal about yourself. And then at the end of each chapter, it challenges you to go out and learn about other cultures, sample other foods, attend DEI conferences, volunteer in the community, and so much more. So again, this is Tamika Peters. Thank you again, Elbert. And stay tuned for more empowering content on the Grow Your Nonprofit podcast. Goodbye.
Introducing the Grow Your Nonprofit merch in our Etsy store. So go on over to our Etsy store today and explore our collection. Pick your favorites. By doing so, you're not only elevating your style, but also contributing to the Grow Your Nonprofit mission. Thank you for being part of our community, and thank you for your dedication to making a difference. We appreciate your support, and we can't wait to see you rocking our Grow Your Nonprofit merch. Now stay tuned for more empowering content on Grow Your Nonprofit podcast. And until our next time, keep growing and keep giving.
Don't walk away, you never walk away before we get it.